So we're here today talking to artist Zoe Scoglio about her practice. So we're going to talk about the notion of home and connection to place and the role of your practice in that. So do you think you could just start off basically telling us about your practice, what you do?
Yeah, I guess my practice is in quite a state of transition at the moment, so it's hard to pinpoint one thing. Previously I have a background in site responsive and participatory performance making and video and sound and installation, and also work quite collaboratively in different contexts. I've just returned from being overseas for a couple of years, and I was studying a course in arts praxis, which is very much looking at the intersection of theory and practice, artistic practice. And in that process I've, I think, undone my practice more than anything, and so I'm in a state where I'm really interested in art as the space of art as a space of study or co-learning, and as a space where different socialities and communities can form. So I'm thinking at the moment more about how art can be a place to generate different ways, different knowledges, different methodologies, and practicing different ways of being in the world at the moment. So thinking about creative practice more broadly.
Were you previously, you said that you've undone your practice to get there, so was your practice previously more like individual, like
solo?
Previously there were sort of distinct works and outcomes that were very much in response to different contexts or sites. For example, I did a work out at Calder Park Raceway a few years ago, or down at the Western Treatment Plant, the waste Melbourne sewage gets processed, as examples of sites that I would respond to. And previously my work was very much grounded in an interest in the geological. And so this was always a theme that was underpinning a lot of my solo practice, and still is very important. But since returning, or since studying it, I've been more thinking around what happens behind the scenes of an artistic practice rather than the outcome, but how to share the processes and the practices that happen whilst creating a work, and thinking also about the dialogues that emerge out of a work when people see a work. So I'm thinking more around the peripheral elements of an artistic practice.
That's interesting. Would you, in terms of what you present, how would you present that?
I mean, at the moment I've been looking at different models, also with another artist, Liz Dunn, who's based in Castlemaine at the moment.
I know that name.
And other artists that I've been collaborating overseas through my studies, and conversations I've been having with other artists, looking at other sort of support structures, ways of sharing practice, both with other artists, but also as ways of facilitating workshops or encounters with the general public. A lot of my practice is very much driven by the intersecting crises that we're facing in the world, especially environmentally, and thinking a lot around the climate crisis, which has a very temporal urgency, a sort of knowledge that we've got, say, 8 or 9 years or so as humans on the planet to shift the way we live, especially in the West, in the globalized world, in order to mitigate the extent of climate change. And so I'm very interested in this sort of temporal time frame, and how that can be a catalyst to bring in different conversations around climate justice and social justice, and re-questioning the ways, especially in the West, we live our lives and imagine the world and our role and our within it.
So would you say that the outcomes of one of your works, or a work of yours, where you're heading, it's about there being a space for participants or collaborators to voice things, or to share their experiences and knowledge? Is that?
Definitely. Right at the moment I've been with other artists facilitating different sorts of reading groups and study groups which are really about opening up a space of dialogue and exchange, and making space for the knowledge that exists within the room, that we all have situated experiences, and find ways to unpack and collectively digest critical theory or different ideas around the world, but to see how they resonate with the people in the room who have very different lived experiences. And
so I saw one of your works that was your thesis, was it? That
yes.
Where you had a whole lot of people in the room and you printed single sheets, is that right, and distributed. Was that a thesis from your recent study, or is it?
It was.
Right.
Yeah.
And was that in Rotterdam, or was that?
That was, because the course that I was doing was a nomadic roaming course. That study week we were living and studying and eating in and presenting our work in Berlin.
Right.
So that was in a venue called Silent Green, which was actually an old crematorium that's been turned into an art space.
Wow.
There. So it has a very particular architecture and history and feel to it.
How did that go? Because I saw the stills, but people were actively discussing, because I noticed there was pages on the tour and things like that.
Yeah, yep.
How did that play out?
So because of the limitations of that framework, it was only a 20-minute performance. So normally I've been engaged in longer periods. Another artist called Lucy Dry, who's based in Rotterdam, we've been developing a project called the Entangled Readers, which is maybe more indicative of the direction that I'm headed, which has where we create space around 3 hours or so as a minimum sort of workshop time, so there really is that time to discuss and to feedback. Or there's been summer schools that we've taken part in where we've had the luxury of being with the same group of people over a few days, and can keep returning to different exercises and processes to read together and bring in different embodied and somatic practices that I often use in my artistic practice, where I use my body and my voice in different performance outcomes, but looking at what those tools are as a way of processing information or bringing a different presence collectively for us to go deeper into some of the sometimes challenging or confronting ideas presented in a text.
So there's the relational component to knowledge. Would you say that that's sort of at the heart of it?
Definitely. There's definitely a relational approach to my practice and an ecological approach, both environmentally and socially. And it's very much coming from a space that I'm learning as well. So I'm not an authority on a matter, but I'm sort of very interested in drawing on my artistic knowledge and skill sets to create conditions for different types of dialogues and relations to form. And so really thinking about the site and the way of inviting people into dialogue and the way of holding that space and bringing the whole body and embodied knowledge into these dialogues and this self-reflexivity within that.
It's interesting to me what you're saying, because something that I'm interested in my work is how to create a methodology for telling the story without dominating other stories, and particularly as a white Westerner, like how do you do that? Which it sounds like that's sort of similar to what you're trying to do. Is the power play something that you think about? Like if you're
totally. I mean, each context and each group of people and as a very particular power dynamic, and I think I'm very aware of myself being a European white woman, and the limitations and the blindness that I have from my position of privilege and the particular life experience that I've had, and this interest in opening up space for dialogue over monologue, or I'm thinking a lot as well of dialogical forms as forms where we can collectively build images together, where we all have our own particular situated knowledge, but where we're coming out of, or we're in the West, we're very much in a monocultural, like they're the dominant culture that has a very particular logic and worldview that comes out of enlightenment, that comes out of white supremacy and these sorts of power dynamics and ways of thinking and controlling and monetizing the world, and how much so I've been thinking a lot of how how that also informs my self and my imaginary. And so the interest in opening up dialogue is to definitely allow multiple perspectives and voices to be heard in a non-hierarchical way, but also understanding that we need in the West to also prioritise the voices and the knowledges of those people that are excluded from dominant culture.
So about the Berlin project.
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought I'm just sort of rethinking through what that project was. So as I was saying, it didn't have a space for dialogue in the work because of the time frame, but I was very interested. There were sort of different components going on to the work, one of which was an idea of a collective optics, or like by positioning people in a circle, it became, and all of them having only a little piece or a fragment of a half-finished thesis that was in process. It was also inviting people to know that they only have one piece of the puzzle, and that would be different from someone else's. On one hand, it was this, thinking through collective visioning processes or collective optics, but also ideas of the soma optics, which is a term that's come up recently with some of the practices that I was involved in with my studies collectively and my own work, which was how through somatic practices, through moving and being aware of the movement, what images come to mind. So looking at the feedback loops of not only how our images and our imaginaries inform how we move in the world, but how our movements inform how we imagine and our actions. And so that's sort of applying a term that people like Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen is one example of, like body-mind centering is one example of many different embodied somatic practices that look at those sorts of feedback loops. So that was informing, on one hand, this work, but in more of a theatrical way, where I was also looking at how the paper as it fell, I was sort of visually representing how ideas change the way we physically or emotionally are in the world, and the movements we take. So I was quite literally playing with the paper of my thesis as it was dropped from the balcony of this amazing strange room, and inviting the public to help as I shoved the paper to sort of make me into a giant mutant creature. And I think it was I was interested in how to visually represent what's going on internally when one's reading and engaging with different forms of knowledge, how it changes you as a person as well, and sort of playing with that idea of how that also makes one move differently, not continuing in the same way, but allowing that to mutate you or deviate you from a path gone otherwise. So exploring new and unknown terrain and movements.
So in that sense, the somatic component of a work like that is your body's obviously really critical in that process, and you were in the centre for some of it, weren't you? But the participants' bodies are obviously critical as well. Are they aware of the sort of feedback, or is that explained to them, or is that just...
In this instance, because it was more of a performative abstraction, it wasn't as explicitly communicated. There was an introductory text where I more poetically talked about what we consume with our eyes, whether we're reading it or observing it in the world, how that enters our body, and sort of, I guess it was one example through the text that I situated the work within, was exploring these boundaries between the world out there and the world inside, and finding different mechanisms that occur within our bodies to acknowledge that they're often one and the same, or there's not a clear distinction. So in this instance, I was looking at the eye, the pupil, as a black hole, or as this hole in our body of where information actually is absorbed into our body. So I guess this work is an example of sometimes the absurd or surreal approach that I sometimes take to my works, or playful approach, which I think can rupture a familiarity of things and allow other sorts of conversations or awarenesses to perhaps emerge. But in the more conversational, the study groups or the reading groups that I've been part of, where I bring these embodied practices that I engage in my own work or practice, it's very much not about me in this sense, but it's more about the creating of the conditions or offering up different methodologies and framings or questionings for people to bring their own form. So it's not as aesthetically formed, I guess, in this way.
It sounds like the site is really important in your work. You said you've done site-specific stuff. How does that translate to, home, basically? Like, how important is that to your practice?
Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot at the moment of what it means to be here in this land called Australia and on Jaja Warung land. And I feel like since I've returned, because I returned at the beginning of March, or end of March, from the Netherlands, where I've been studying for 3 years and living, and I arrived back sooner than anticipated because of COVID. So at the moment I'm in this very particular spot because we're just now coming out of lockdown after sort of 7 months, and I've been very much in this home, this lovely rented share house that I've been really lucky to find or be in. But this has also been this process of returning to Australia, and I feel in lots of ways I'm returning or arriving for the first time, in a sense. That I think the perspective of thinking about Australia whilst being overseas, and also thinking through its colonial histories, and also realising how little I do actually know around Australian cultural histories and colonial histories and Indigenous histories, and the many histories that exist. And so there's a real desire to learn more about this land that I'm on, and also the space of art, like what are the histories also in Castlemaine that I'm coming into, and so this question of home, because it's living, this thing of settling or unsettling when we're living on unceded lands, and as a white person on these lands, I've been thinking a lot about what that means, and there's no answers. It's all such a complexity, but I'm very interested also through my practice, but also in my life, to be engaged in dialogues to unpack that complexity and the complicit sort of nature and the implication of myself within these systems, and also possibilities of ways to live. Present. Anyway, I'm going on a big tangent.
No. Yeah, actually not. This is talking like precisely about what is very helpful for me to hear.
Okay, great. I'm just realising, because there's so many layers of lots of layers and lots of delicacies and complexities, and I think, even just like being in Castlemaine, because I'm from Melbourne originally.
What I was going to ask you, because you said your parents live here.
Yeah, I'll go back to that. Yeah, so okay, it might make more sense also for any viewers in the future. So I basically grew up in Melbourne, and my parents have been living in around Castlemaine for 17 years or so. So I've been here a lot, but never lived here. And when I was overseas, I knew very much that I wanted to live in this area for multiple reasons. So I was sort of projecting myself here, but as I mentioned, it happened sooner than anticipated. But always living in a city, it's very interesting to kind of rethink what an artistic practice is in a smaller community and in a regional setting, and also when you're more present with the ecology, which can be disguised under bitumen and under sort of this international urban environment in the city. So I've just been very much in this lockdown period, slowing down and being present, like lots of people, with the location that one finds oneself in these times. And even the fact we don't have bitumen on the road here or street lights, there's a very different quality to this place. Anyway, it's got me thinking a lot, but also wanting to know more about who and what is happening, who is here and what is happening locally, and to really reconsider my artistic practice on a local scale. And from that situated position still engage in conversations that are happening across the planet, and with my friends and colleagues overseas, but from a very grounded, embedded and embodied position, within this area. And I think I've been thinking a lot also around the history, obviously with this being gold mining country and the mining boom, and what and there's so many sites here with holes that still puncture the earth, and the sort of degraded landscape, and where the history is still very present on the surface, and the implications of this mining boom on the Indigenous peoples, but also in Melbourne, the wealth that Melbourne has come from originally, a big part of that was from this area and the mining booms and the gold rush. And so thinking through those legacies and those relationships and those sites of healing, or to readdress also the toxicity of these damaged landscapes, and how they might also open up dialogue of being with also our own embeddedness or indebtedness to this site and these histories as non-Indigenous people.
So the work are you making works around that at the moment? Is that something that you're looking at?
I'm not making work. I'm sort of resisting making work because I feel like there's still so much to learn, and so it's really, I'm trying to find different ways just to be in dialogue with people, and I've been going very gently around this.
You said that your works at the moment kind of are dialogue, that's what you're doing.
So at this point I'm just sort of also trying to be humble, or not jump into things, but actually just learn and understand what it means to be here and these communities that exist here.
So the making of works is part of that learning in a way.
Or the learning
is the work also.
That leads up to a work maybe. It sounds like research is a significant component for a long time with your practice.
It is. For sure. And I think that my own drive and curiosity, is something I use to then open up space to share that with others, or find others who have similar, where our curiosities intersect, and then see what comes from that.
So is there a place that feels like home to you at the moment? Is that here, or would it be Melbourne, or is there no particular place, Australia? Or?
I mean, being overseas for 3 years, and in this course it was quite dislocated because we'd move. It was set up where we'd be in a different location for 1 week every month, where we would study together, eat together, live together in this very intensive environment, which created a great sense of community on one sense, or a sense of home, but in this very weird nomadic way that was never really located. And in the weeks between, the students were dispersed all around Europe and the world in different ways, so there wasn't this sense of community that was automatically, it was situated within automatically.
So the students changed from week to week?
It was the same students. So you'd be involved in a 2-year-long program, and there'd be lots of guest artists and guest facilitators and researchers coming in, so there was always a moving sort of contingent, but you'd be in it for 2 years with the same people. But this course, the Dutch Art Institute, it was called, Masters of Arts Praxis, was the course. But during this, and during my own research and my writing for my thesis, I was very much trying to engage embodied somatic practices in the writing to kind of keep myself sane, also as someone who's not an academic researcher and entering this space for the first time, of trying to find language and understanding the histories and the context in which I was thinking about my work, as a way to ground myself, to keep myself sane, but also because I was very much interested in embodied knowledge, and not just thinking with the head but thinking with the whole body. And also, I'm sort of rambling around, but basically I'm saying this because home, in a sense, although I wouldn't necessarily use that language, but a way of connecting is through the practices, or trying to find out what are the daily practices or regular practices that help create a sense of connection and belonging in that sense. So that was something I was doing in this dislocated space of the studies while I was living in Rotterdam and Amsterdam and different places.
Did you have any enlightenment on that? Like, were there particular practices that really have struck you, or that you would hang on to now as you're back here, that are grounding for you, or, you know, anchoring? Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I go through waves of being very committed to a practice, and then I totally forget and get into my head. Like, it's such hard work.
Yeah.
Bad habits die hard, which are the ones, you know, which was the reason I also shifted my practice, the unsustainable nature of just like working intensely on an outcome. I was realizing that really wasn't sustainable on many different levels. So thinking more about actually how does the artistic practice be prioritized in the grounding or the creating of conditions and connections and relations, both with oneself and with others. So, I mean, I draw upon different, I've been continuing to do different, Feldenkrais is another term, and also my mum and my dad, I very much inherited different skills and knowledges through them.
Because they're dancers.
Because they were both dancers. And then from that, they've both been very much, mum's a Feldenkrais practitioner and dad teaches Tai Chi and does Shiatsu and trained as a Shiatsu practitioner. So...
Oh, that makes sense with your embodied and somatic.
Yeah, so sorry, I probably should have said that at the beginning. I'm trying to think of like what is the
but it's so interesting for those, that sort of sense of the body, and to see that being translated into an art practice. Like, it's not it's not necessarily.
It's not that you're
yeah.
Yeah, and I think being overseas wasn't just getting the perspective on Australia or Victoria or Melbourne from a distance, but it was also very much about myself and the distancing. I think there was enough distance from my parents to be able to understand actually how much I have inherited from them, including a way of being in the world, and that hasn't just been, that's very much informed my artistic practice. And even when I use video or use other forms or use sound, I'm still very much engaging that through this sort of embodied sensitivity that I've gained from growing up as a kid with parents who think and move in a very particular way from their trainings.
So is there something then that you would do to ground yourself here, besides the fact that your parents are here, in terms of that embodied experience of the location, or say this house, or, you know, your current residence? Are there ways that you consciously do that, or do you think it just sort of happens as a course of you living in a space? I mean, these times have been so weird. I'm still finding out what that might be going forward. But I mean, an example of daily practices are sort of just walking in the garden or walking outside in the mornings or in the evenings after dark. And then there's been different practice sharing models with, for example, this artist Liz Dunn, where we've been sort of asking this question of how to hold that space for each other. And so Liz's practice is also very much ecologically minded and about being out in sight together. So we've also been going through her initiation on sort of silent walks together, or sharing different movement practices together as well. And there's a lot of different, so I don't stick to one. There's also lots of voice from sort of had years of different voice training with different teachers, and there's also been really great techniques that they bring, just of different breath or sounding sort of warm-up exercises that I try and do as well. So that's not necessarily part of making work, that might just be part of how you regulate yourself, or but in doing that I'm hoping also to bring it, I have brought my voice training into some of the reading groups, like this Entangled Readers, for example. We would I'd often bring in different collective vocalizing exercises and warm-ups as a way also to help the dialogue flow, or that connection of like the gut knowledge, or like to allow space to sort of rupture the formality, or the create an unfamiliar space together. Because
using voice can be quite confronting for a lot of people who aren't used to it. So it's trying to find gentle ways to allow a bit of play and allow oneself to kind of warm up the vocal tract for speaking and being in conversation.
Do you think, back to what you were saying about your work with Liz Dunn and going for walks and being amongst your environment, do you think that's got something particularly to do with the natural environment, or is that something that you could do in Melbourne, like you were saying, with the bitumen and the street lights?
Both. And I think my practice, every space you're in has such a different quality and history and presence to take into account, and my practice has always been very much engaged in breaking down these binaries of nature, culture, and through the geological previously was one way of looking at how the natural world and the rocks and the geology that exists makes its way into our daily lived environments through the cameras, the tools we use, and the infrastructures that we create, as sort of breaking down those binaries. And I think that's still something that I'm very driven, or committed to, is or that's very present in my work, as the a sort of trans-dualist approach, or not looking at the binaries of mind and body, or nature and culture, or inside and outside, or self and other as distinct, separate forms. So this is always in my thinking, and it's really hard because you realise, because of the language, the English language, and how we articulate things, I'm always using the binaries to try and move beyond the binaries. But this, in thinking about the Western imaginary, or through what are these assumptions as people that have grown up in the West, and these logics of that we've inherited through Enlightenment and categorization of the world, and so that's sort of, again, another tangent, but to answer that question, I guess, around sight or ecology more broadly as being something that brings in both all elements of our lived experience.
Yeah, it sounds like a new language is something that's needed, as you talk about that. We need more ways of discussing those sort of intermediary conditions of separation or intermingled state.
Which I guess is one reason I bring the body often into it, and it's something that's hard to articulate in words, but it's very much through the experience that certain ideas, I think, can be processed or understood, and not just on a cerebral level, but on a very personal level. I think the body's a great, it's how it's our reality in a way. So I think.
Do you think it can get recorded, those somatic experiences? Because I think that's what seems initially confusing about it, is that the bodily experience might be fleeting and not captured, not retained in any sort of systematic way, and hence why logic might dominate over those experiences. Is that something that comes into what you're doing? I guess by videoing it, you're doing that.
That's the tricky thing of trying to find the value and communicate it to others, and especially in this time of lockdown where there's been so much online things happening, and that's the way you connect and communicate. And on the one hand, there's been some great moments where we have with other artists, and with Liz Dunn, and this Energy Fields project, for example, we did with was a development with Amrita Hepi and Victoria Hunt, who are other great artists. We did some sharing of practice over the internet because they were in different locations during lockdown. But we all realised as well how difficult actually it is. Even participating in the experience digitally is still such a limited experience, because there's so much that we're relying on being present together in space and picking up on, and so much information that's present when your body's together in space that just can't be translated effectively. So people do try, and I think there's some great sort of people working poetically as well, critically and poetically, that try to distort the language and communicate experiences. But I think if someone hasn't actually had the experience, it's very difficult to communicate that, and actually it's just a matter of doing it or finding ways to bring people into different encounters and creating sort of support structures or frameworks where that can be engaged on an ongoing basis as well. Or
That's a different result, isn't it? Rather than locking it down, it becomes a performed, ongoing thing.
Yeah.
Just a quick one though, in being here in a regional area then, with what you're saying about lockdown and also the disadvantages of using the internet for some of these things, do you think that's going to be an issue for you?
I mean, who knows what how the lockdowns are going to continue. But I'm really interested in connecting with people here in Castlemaine.
Right.
And you know, not just within the arts, but getting to know more about other groups, other communities that exist here. So in that sense, I really do want to situate what I'm doing here, and see where that then goes.
If that moves further afield.
So I mean, I'm also trying to be in this very responsive space where I'm not trying to dictate. I'm just sort of listening and learning and seeing where that takes me. But I mean, of course, we do rely so heavily on the internet, and I say that while I'm still doing all these study groups, and I'm part of different working groups at the moment overseas. So that is quite amazing, actually, to have those connections and communities, even though I'm aware of the limitations and the challenges, and I think I'm also aware how I feel like that's stopping me from being present. So I'm also in this moment of my own contradictions of like, hang on, how do I do both, or do I have to just put one aside for now? For example, there's this great working group that's formed around this climate justice code that I'm part of, and it emerged out of an assembly that Casco Art Institute in Utrecht initiated to ask the question of what practical measures can artists and arts institutes take to care for the planetary commons. It was the tagline at that assembly, and brought together lots of different practitioners and institutions to begin to discuss these questions, but not just from the terms of like recycling or flights, but looking at a deeper foundational level and sort of thinking about how the radical imagination might play a role in sort of reimagining the space of art and the institutions and the infrastructures that support it. So very big questions. So that's been ongoing since I've returned, where I'm still working with a lot of people in the Netherlands and around Europe on figuring out what this code might look like, or as a way of bringing different people on board to think together and art.
So by code you mean way for artists? How do artists help, basically?
Yeah, sort of creating, I guess, it's looking at climate justice, so how, climate change is very much a symptom of these sort of intersecting injustices in the world, and especially around race, and looking at how whiteness as well of the institutions in Europe and in settler states also have been implicated in these histories that are contributing to climate change. So it's been a really interesting history lesson also to learn about how different histories of colonialism and capitalism play out, and how arts historically have, in the Western sense, have sort of sat within those infrastructures. So I mean, it's a big thing to unpack. So we're still in this existential moment of thinking of the many ways that a code as such can play, and one is on the term of legislation, of thinking about more committing to being part of the questioning, because it's such big questions. So it's a lot of it isn't about the answers, but being committed to staying with the trouble, as you might say, or learning how you as an artist or as an institution are able to shift patterns of behaviour, and what kind of communities and support structures might form or be necessary in order to transition from one way of working to looking at art as a space that's more committed to the local communities and ecologies and that it's part of. So I mean, that's been really great as a process, but also is feeling now I'm very distant from it, and so I'm sort of questioning whether to put that, looking at the limitations of what it is to work at such a distance on such complex issues, and actually we need to be in the same room together and have longer moments. So like, what are the what's enabled in different conditions, and over Zoom there's a limit, I think, to the depth of the conversation and the collective thinking that can happen as well. So it's definitely got a role, the internet, and I'm looking forward to it, and I do use it, and it's great, of course. But yeah, it's that balance, or looking at the complexity within that.
Just to bring it back to this idea of home, so that even the concept of being at home, we're just interested in your ideas and reflections on what that means, and whether that might be an actual place, or if it's more of a feeling or a process, which is sort of what I'm getting from what you've been saying so far. And whether, say, for example, we, as someone who's lived in all sorts of different places, how you reconcile that yourself in terms of, is it something that has to, you know, once you actually do it in some sort of proper way, that's something that you stick with and you put down those roots, or is it more of a, you know, experiential, more fluid process?
I mean, it's many things, but I have been thinking a lot more about it as being a process or a practice, and what are those sort of daily rituals or habits that form. And I mean, I think even that word, like inhabitation or habitat, as well, being, you know, like indicating towards the habits that we undertake individually and collectively, as a way of forming that ecology or those relations that hold you in a sense of connection and belonging. So that's very much, I think, where I'm at. I'm aware, because my parents moved here just before I was born. They migrated as dancers. Mum's from England and dad's Italian ancestry via America. Wow. And I think growing up with parents who aren't from Australia, and also in Melbourne around quite a multicultural and diverse area, there was definitely you know, this Eurocentric nature of my life, or also my artistic practice, and you know, that's very much in the arts. It feels like in Australia at large, and it's slowly shifting, and it's actually been really great these last 3 years returning to Australia and seeing actually how much it feels like the dialogue and the discourse in the arts in Melbourne anyway has shifted from quite a white space and dominated space to one that is opening up to all sorts of really interesting voices and critical dialogues from people that have previously been marginalised. And so I'm sort of, again, going on this tangent. Okay.
We like a tangent.
Okay, great. Because home, this thing, I think, when I mentioned before how I feel like I'm arriving for the first time, it's also like not arriving in this sort of illusion of this European city, but actually what is it to be in this settled lands of Australia, and committing to a location. And I think in the city, you know, it's quite transient. People are on the move. People are always going overseas or traveling for their work. And I think with this lockdown, I mean, I don't know, I feel like almost I'm just like never gonna go anywhere. I have really not taken the opportunity of travelling, you know, in Victoria, whereas my housemates have gone on trips. I've sort of just really been in this garden a lot, and then for walks nearby. And I should get out, probably more for my own mental health. But I'm just this sort of, being with this shock of being really grounded in a place. With the flights, you know, that account, you know, the inability to fly or move interstate, and just trying to think about what it is to be present in a particular context. Hang on, where am I? So the idea of home in regards to family as well, and habits feel really important. But I think it's more about, for me, the kind of projection is not so much about like property and ownership and fixed forms, but more continuing to grow these different ways of relating or meeting and encountering others both human and more than human, as a way of getting a sense of homeliness.
But just a quick one then, in terms of being in this actual house and share housing. Is that something, maybe not even so much share housing, but that's an aspect of your home, but does your creative practice impact on where you're living right now, and vice versa? Does it infiltrate what you're doing, and do you notice that?
Yeah, totally. There's not sort of at the moment, also with this lockdown period and COVID, these clear distinctions of where my practice begins and ends. And as I was mentioning before as well, of like being interested in what conditions enable different ideas or conversations or awarenesses to emerge. The same goes with my physical home, which I'm very aware that, because there's 5 of us living here, the rent is, affordable despite my own precarity and not knowing where I'll get future work, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but I'm able to, just these material conditions make things possible. Of having cheap rent is quite amazing, and having a space that I have where I use as my studio, and I can roll on the ground, or I can do my singing or my exercises, and there's nice light, and
that's here in the house.
Yeah,
you've got a room.
Yeah, so having a space that's dedicated to certain activities, I think, is so important. Creating that.
I wonder what would happen if you didn't have that, like how your practice would be affected if you didn't have cheap rent and the room, given that yours is an embodied and, there's a vocal performative component.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky. I mean, rent is the huge one, and, if one's material needs like that aren't covered, then you can't do much else if you're just trying to survive. So I feel incredibly privileged and lucky to be here, and I think there's also ways to get creative about thinking about how to work within those limitations. Yes. So it's about maybe carving out a space in the living room where you tell your housemates, like, I'm going to twice a week I'm going to use this, and move all the furniture back and claim it as a art space. So I think I've been thinking a lot around that with our house, how you've got rooms dedicated to certain activities. And when we first came in to this house, thinking creatively of okay, well, what are the possibilities, and how am I, how the architecture really dictates the kinds of activities that can take place. So thinking about how to reclaim a space, what is a sort of practice that one values, and how to make space for that physically as well.
So that's where your creativity can come into making the space inhabitable for you and something that you attach to. Would you say there's a material component to that? Do you think the actual belongings and maybe even making stuff in that space is important, or do you think that's less relevant? No, I mean, I think I think one's external environment mimics also one's internal headspace. So as a way to kind of, keep your thoughts in order, cleaning your space or keeping it sort of in a certain state, I think is very helpful. Yeah. And there's moments where my study gets very chaotic, and I'm very aware that's how I'm feeling. So it's okay, I need to also keep that discipline or practice of tidying and keeping up with that, because I get sometimes too caught up in the ideas and the possibilities that I kind of need to ground myself. So it's very much what I need as a human. Yeah. But coming back from overseas, it was very much a 2-week turnaround of suddenly realizing with COVID that I had to leave, and sort of giving all of my possessions away. Yeah, of course.
And seeing what I could fit into a suitcase. I couldn't get 2 suitcases because the costs had gone up when I came. So it was basically what I could fit in a suitcase I brought back with me. And there was something extremely liberating and traumatic simultaneously about that experience. Yeah. And it was lovely just to give things away to friends and be here, take everything. But it was at the time when everyone was also hoarding supplies and toilet paper. So it was a really traumatic moment to be letting go in this way. But So I haven't, like my own possessions, I'm still quite light on the ground, but my housemates have been accumulating beautiful things, and I feel I'm very lucky to be able to use them. And similarly with like their skills of gardening, so this is something I've never done in the city. I've never had a garden.
Right.
And I've always been really terrible actually at these regular patterns, which is why I think in my practice I'm exploring more of these daily rhythms as an attempt to ground me and be attentive.
Are you gardening now? Here?
Yeah, I've got great teachers, so I've been gardening and on watering duty in the evenings.
That's so good. That is a grounding practice, don't you think? Watering.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And meditative. And,
And just the life force, like as you're watering the plants after a hot day, and you can really feel them getting so
perky.
it's like, oh, hello. And again, it's one of those experiences that you can kind of talk about on paper, but actually the experience of doing that and being immersed in this happy garden is such a nourishing feeling that words on paper can't do that justice.
Seems really critical that is true, isn't it? It's the experiential aspect of these things that really makes sense, where you might not make sense out of it if you read about it or if someone suggested you do something.
Totally. And I think that's coming back to my studies, or in general looking at so many great ideas that are generated within academic spaces and critical theory about different ways of being in the world, but it feels like there's still such a need for different tools to try and put that into action, or what does that look like in practice. And
I couldn't agree more. That critical bridging, or I guess it's a communication.
Yeah, totally. So I think that's what I'm interested in with my practice, is very much where that can be of assistance or be part of that inquiry of like what is that, to move from an idea into action, and how do those practices inform the ideas, and vice versa, the ideas informing the actions.
Amazing. I love that.
Anyway, we'll see. I mean, it's also very much about failing and vulnerability and being honest, trying things, realising that's not working, getting out of one's comfort zones, and unsettling familiar patterns together in joyful ways, maybe. Or not, sometimes. But, yeah.
What do you think, Helen?
I think that's great. That's so interesting. I really want to, follow what you do. It's fascinating.
Stay in contact about things. Yeah.
I'm realising as well how much being isolated in the home, I've been thinking and talking over Zoom, and also to my housemates, but maybe not in such a deeper way, but how I have a lot of ideas that need to be unpacked, and so I'm sorry if I've bombarded you.
No, it's the opposite. We're extremely grateful that you've got that.
Yeah, all I can say is that you sound like you have thought about everything. Like you're so thoughtful. You feel, it sounds like someone who's put a lot of thought into it, which is awesome.
Which is wonderful for us, because then we've been throwing curly thing questions at you, and you've handled it all brilliantly.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, it was great chatting. I look forward to hearing more about your practices.
Yes, we will stay in touch for sure.